Imagine living in a space so small you cannot stand upright. A space where the air is suffocating, the light barely filters in, and every sound from outside reminds you of the danger that waits if you are discovered. For 7 long years, Harriet Jacobs endured this nightmare, hiding in a cramped attic crawl space just 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and only 3 feet high. She lived there not because she was guilty of a crime, but because she was guilty of yearning for freedom. Born into slavery in North Carolina, Harriet Jacobs knew from a young age the cruelty of bondage, the exploitation, the threats, and the constant fear of being separated from her loved ones. But she was determined to defy the system that sought to break her. After years of abuse at the hands of her master, Jacobs made a choice that would test the very limits of human endurance: to confine herself in darkness rather than be confined in chains. For nearly a decade, she listened to her children's voices through cracks in the wood, unable to hold them, unable to reveal herself. Her story is not only about suffering, but about resilience, the strength of a mother's love, and the willpower to outlast oppression. This is the story of Harriet Jacobs, the woman who turned 7 years of hiding into a weapon against slavery, and whose voice, through her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, helped awaken the conscience of a nation. In the early 19th century, the United States stood divided, a nation torn between its ideals of liberty and its reality of bondage. The northern states had begun, slowly and unevenly, to distance themselves from the institution of slavery. But in the South, slavery was not just an economic system. It was a way of life, defended by law, religion, and violence. Cotton, tobacco, and rice plantations thrived on the backs of millions of enslaved African Americans, whose labor created vast fortunes for white planters while condemning generations to chains. For enslaved women, the brutality of this system had its own particular horrors. Beyond the endless work in fields and households, they lived with the constant threat of sexual exploitation, coercion, and the loss of their children. Their bodies were seen as both tools of labor and vessels for profit. For every child born into slavery was automatically enslaved as well. It was into this world that Harriet Jacobs was born in 1813 in Edenton, North Carolina. Her early years were marked by contradictions that would shape her understanding of freedom and oppression. She was born into slavery, yet her first 6 years were spent in what seemed, at least to her young eyes, a relatively gentle household. Her mistress taught her to read and sew, unusual privileges for a girl in bondage. For a brief time, Harriet could believe that life might hold something more than toil and suffering, but slavery had a cruel way of stripping illusions. When her mistress died, Harriet, still only a child, was willed to a relative, and her life took a dark turn. No longer shielded by a kinder hand, she became the property of Dr. James Norcom, whom she called Dr. Flint in her memoir. Under his ownership, she would experience the very worst of slavery's abuse. Harriet's story, later published as Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is unique not only for what she endured, but for the clarity with which she exposed the world of enslaved women, a world often hidden in silence and shame. Her narrative revealed truths that many in the 19th century were unwilling to confront: that slavery was not merely chains and whips, but also the constant violation of family, dignity, and womanhood. Harriet Ann Jacobs was born in 1813 in the coastal town of Edenton, North Carolina, a place where slavery and freedom coexisted uneasily. The town's wharves bustled with ships, and wealthy planters and merchants displayed their prosperity in large homes. Yet beneath this veneer of gentility lay the brutal reality that nearly half the population was enslaved. Harriet's earliest memories belonged to this world of contradiction. one where a child could learn to read and smile at her grandmother's stories, yet still remain the legal property of another. Her father, Elijah, was a skilled carpenter, valued for his craftsmanship, though still enslaved. Her mother, Delilah, worked as a house servant, known for her quiet strength and devotion to her children. Harriet and her younger brother, John, were the center of their mother's love. For a short time, the family lived together in what seemed like a fragile peace. When Harriet was just 6 years old, her mother died. The loss devastated her, leaving her and John in the care of their grandmother, Molly Horniblow, a woman whose resilience and moral strength would become one of the guiding forces of Harriet's life. Molly, though technically free by this point, still lived in a world that constrained her every action. She was a baker, earning a modest income, and she became both protector and provider for her grandchildren. Harriet's early years also carried a rare gift. Her first mistress, a relatively kind woman, allowed her to learn to read and sew. This was highly unusual, as literacy among enslaved people was often banned or punished harshly. For Harriet, those lessons opened a window to another world, a world where words carried power, where one could imagine a life beyond bondage. At this tender age, she could not yet see the full weight of slavery pressing down upon her, but childhood illusions do not last long under slavery. When her mistress died, Harriet, barely entering her teens, was passed down like property in a will. She would become the possession of Dr. James Norcom, whom she later renamed Dr. Flint in her memoir. To him, Harriet was not a child, nor a student, nor even a servant. She was a young girl whose body, labor, and future belonged entirely to him. This transfer of ownership marked the end of Harriet's childhood innocence. The comfort of her grandmother's home, the joy of learning letters, the faint hope that kindness might soften slavery's chains, all of it began to unravel. What awaited her under Dr. Flint's control would shape not only her destiny, but also her decision to one day take an extraordinary gamble, to hide herself away in darkness rather than submit to the degradations he intended for her. When Harriet Jacobs entered her teenage years, she became the focus of Dr. James Norcom, the man she would later call Dr. Flint. He was wealthy, influential, and outwardly respectable. But behind closed doors, his character was defined by cruelty, arrogance, and predatory desire. To him, Harriet was not a girl deserving of dignity. She was property, and therefore subject to his will. From the age of 15, Harriet lived under a shadow of fear. Flint subjected her to constant harassment, whispering threats and promises in her ear, attempting to bend her spirit to his desires. Unlike the physical cruelty of the lash, this form of abuse was insidious, invading her privacy and corrupting her peace of mind. Harriet described how she could not walk across a room without feeling his eyes upon her, nor sleep soundly without fearing his next approach. But Harriet was not passive. She recognized the trap being laid for her and fought with every ounce of courage to protect herself. She refused Flint's advances, defied his commands when she could, and sought refuge in her grandmother's house. Her grandmother, Molly Horniblow, stood as her fiercest defender, shielding her from as much harm as possible. Yet even Molly's protection had limits. The law recognized Harriet as Flint's property, and the courts would never side with a black woman against a white master. Desperate to break Harriet's resistance, Flint used psychological warfare. He threatened to sell her children should she ever bear them, and he boasted that he would build a separate house in which to imprison her away from her family. These threats weighed heavily, reminding Harriet that even her body's autonomy was denied her. In her memoir, she described slavery's cruelty for women as far worse than what men endure, for we are subjected to wrongs and mortifications peculiarly our own. Faced with such relentless torment, Harriet made a daring and controversial choice. She began a relationship with another white man, Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, a local lawyer who later became a congressman. By entering this relationship, she sought to escape Flint's control, hoping Sawyer's status would shield her and her children from being completely at the mercy of her master. The decision reflected not weakness, but strategy. Harriet, like so many enslaved women, had to navigate impossible choices in order to survive. This period of her life revealed both the depths of slavery's corruption and the resilience of Harriet's will. She endured not only Flint's obsession, but also the stigma and judgment that came with her choices. Yet above all, she remained clear about her purpose. She would endure anything to protect her children and to one day secure freedom for herself and them. It was this determination, the love of a mother fused with the courage of a survivor, that eventually drove her to an astonishing decision. Rather than submit to Flint, rather than risk being forced into his prison house, Harriet would vanish into hiding, even if it meant entombing herself in darkness for years. By the time Harriet Jacobs reached her early 20s, her life had become a web of impossible choices. She was a mother now, with 2 young children, Joseph and Louisa, fathered by Samuel Sawyer. Though Sawyer had promised to support them, his influence was limited, and the reality of slavery meant that Harriet's children were still legally the property of Dr. Flint. This gave him a terrible weapon. He could punish Harriet by punishing her children. Dr. Flint's obsession with Harriet had not waned. If anything, the birth of her children enraged him further. He viewed them as obstacles, reminders that Harriet had defied his control. His threats grew more vicious. He hinted that he might sell the children away from her. He vowed that Harriet would never know peace until she submitted fully to his will. The walls of her world were closing in, and every choice before her seemed to lead to despair. Harriet's only sanctuary remained her grandmother's home. Molly Horniblow continued to serve as both shield and guide, offering Harriet courage even as danger pressed closer. But even her grandmother could not stop Flint. The law was on his side, and as long as Harriet remained within his reach, neither she nor her children were safe. At this moment of crisis, Harriet conceived of a plan as desperate as it was extraordinary. She decided to vanish, not by fleeing north, which seemed nearly impossible with Flint's watchful eyes and the fugitive slave law hanging over her, but by hiding in plain sight. If Flint believed she had escaped far away, he might loosen his grip, allowing her children to remain with family rather than being sold in retaliation. The hiding place she chose was almost unthinkable. A crawl space above her grandmother's porch, barely 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and only 3 feet high. In this suffocating attic, she would not be able to stand, rarely able to move freely, and would live in near darkness. Yet it was safer than Flint's advances, safer than the auction block, safer than losing her children forever. With quiet determination, Harriet slipped into the small garret, leaving behind the world of sunlight and freedom she longed for. Her grandmother alone knew the truth of where she was. For Harriet, it was not escape. It was entombment, a living burial. But in that burial, she saw hope. Hope that her children would grow up near their family. Hope that Flint's rage would be blunted, and hope that one day, when the time was right, she could emerge into true freedom. This choice marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance in American slavery. For 7 long years, Harriet Jacobs would endure a prison of her own making, a prison chosen not out of defeat, but out of a mother's fierce determination to save her children from a life of chains. Harriet Jacobs' hiding place was no home. It was a coffin-sized garret tucked above her grandmother's porch, with sloping rafters so low that she could never stand upright. The space measured only 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 3 feet high. It had no ventilation except for tiny cracks between the boards. Sunlight barely reached her. Air was scarce. The heat in summer was suffocating, and the cold in winter cut to her bones. This wasn't life, but survival. And Harriet chose it willingly because it meant protecting her children from Dr. Flint. Inside that crawl space, Harriet carved out an existence that tested the very limits of endurance. For 7 years, she lived in near silence, her body cramping from confinement. She could not stretch her limbs, her muscles weakened. Sores formed on her skin from the dampness and lack of movement. At times, she feared she might lose her mind. Yet she endured, because each day in that attic meant one more day her children remained safe in the arms of her grandmother. The most agonizing part of her confinement was not the darkness, nor the suffocation, nor the gnawing hunger. It was the sound of her children playing just beyond the walls. Through the cracks in the wood, she could hear Joseph and Louisa laughing, crying, calling out to one another. She longed to hold them, to whisper in their ears, to tell them their mother was near. Instead, she remained silent, watching from a distance, like a ghost in her own life. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of them through a tiny peephole she had bored into the wood. Those moments gave her both joy and torment. Joy to see them alive and growing. Torment that she could not reach out and embrace them. Harriet later wrote that she was thankful even for the little opening, for through it, I could watch my children. Her grandmother was her lifeline. Molly Horniblow brought her food, smuggled in letters, and shielded her secret from the outside world. Only a handful of trusted people knew Harriet was hidden there. To the rest of Edenton, it seemed she had disappeared, perhaps fled north. Dr. Flint searched tirelessly, posting notices, sending pursuers, convinced she had escaped. The irony was cruel. While he hunted her across miles of countryside, Harriet lay concealed mere feet from where he often walked. The years dragged on with unbearable monotony. Harriet read what few newspapers and books she could obtain, sharpening her mind even as her body withered. She prayed. She dreamed. She willed herself to remain strong for her children. 7 years is a long time in anyone's life, but in the cramped silence of that attic, time felt endless. And yet, Harriet's confinement was not passive. It was an act of resistance, a deliberate choice to deny Dr. Flint his victory, to keep her children close, and to wait for the moment when she could reclaim her freedom. She turned suffering into strategy. She transformed invisibility into power. And when the day finally came to emerge, she would step back into the world, not broken, but unshaken in her resolve. After 7 years of confinement, Harriet Jacobs knew she could not remain in her grandmother's attic forever. The space had preserved her children's closeness and denied Dr. Flint his power over her, but it was also slowly destroying her body. Her limbs were frail, her health was failing, and the strain of endless silence weighed heavily on her spirit. She longed not only to see her children openly, but also to claim the freedom she had been denied all her life. Opportunities for escape were rare, and the risks were enormous. Fugitive slaves were hunted ruthlessly. Capture meant torture, resale, or death. Even in the North, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 made freedom precarious, as slave catchers could seize escapees and drag them back south. Harriet understood these dangers, but she also knew that staying hidden forever was impossible. With the help of trusted allies, she planned her departure. Her journey began with secrecy. Slipping out of Edenton under cover of darkness, she was aided by members of a clandestine network sympathetic to enslaved people. These allies were part of what would later be known as the Underground Railroad, a fragile, dangerous chain of safe houses, abolitionists, and free black families willing to risk their lives for others' liberty. From North Carolina, Harriet moved cautiously through the South, disguised and concealed, always fearing betrayal. She endured cramped passages on boats and sleepless nights in hiding places, each step carrying the possibility of discovery. At times, she felt hunted like an animal, every creak of the floorboards or shout in the distance quickening her heartbeat. Yet she pressed forward, fueled by the thought of her children and the promise of a freer life. Eventually, Harriet reached Philadelphia, a city where the spirit of abolition burned brightly. There, she encountered members of the anti-slavery movement who recognized her courage and extended their support. From Philadelphia, she traveled to New York, the state of her birth, where she was reunited with her daughter Louisa. That moment of reunion, after years of watching her children only through cracks in the attic wood, was almost unbearable in its joy. Harriet wept openly, clutching her child, knowing that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Yet freedom was not absolute. Harriet remained legally enslaved, vulnerable to capture. She had to live with constant vigilance, knowing Dr. Flint might still pursue her. It was only through the tireless work of her allies, particularly friends in the abolitionist community, that her eventual safety was secured. Her children, too, were brought north in time, and Harriet could finally begin to imagine a life beyond chains, fear, and hiding. Harriet's escape was not simply a flight from slavery. It was a declaration that a woman's will, sharpened by love for her children, could withstand even the darkest oppression. And though she had gained physical freedom, she carried with her the stories of those still trapped in bondage. Stories she would later put into words so the world could never again claim ignorance. Freedom gave Harriet Jacobs her life back, but it also gave her a mission. She had endured the cruelties of slavery, survived 7 years of hiding in a coffin-like attic, and escaped to the north. Yet she could not simply close the door on her past. Too many women remained trapped in silence. Too many children were torn from their mothers. Too many people still lived under the whip. Harriet understood that her story was not hers alone. It was a weapon that could pierce the conscience of the nation. In the 1850s, she began to write her memoir. At first, the task was overwhelming, reliving the years of abuse under Dr. Flint, recalling the torment of hiding while hearing her children's voices just beyond reach, describing choices she had been forced to make that society judged harshly. These memories cut deeply. Yet Harriet pressed on. Her purpose was greater than her pain. She wanted to tell the world the truth of slavery, especially the truth of enslaved women, whose struggles were often ignored even in abolitionist discourse. With the help of abolitionist friends, including the writer Lydia Maria Child, Harriet's manuscript was shaped into a book titled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861. Unlike many slave narratives written by men, Harriet's story gave a voice to the hidden world of enslaved mothers, daughters, and wives. She exposed how slavery invaded not only the body, but also the soul, how it forced impossible choices, and how it turned motherhood into a battlefield of love and survival. In the book, Harriet did not hide her struggles. She admitted to choices that Victorian society considered scandalous, such as her relationship with Samuel Sawyer, but she explained them with clarity. They were the desperate strategies of a woman seeking to protect herself and her children in a world that offered no safe path. Her honesty gave the narrative its power. Readers could no longer pretend that enslaved women were untouched by the sexual violence of slavery. Harriet made them see. The memoir was groundbreaking. It was one of the first widely read slave narratives written by a woman, and it shattered myths that slavery was somehow paternal or gentle in domestic households. Harriet revealed the truth. Slavery was a system of domination that corrupted family life, assaulted women, and crushed the human spirit. Though published on the eve of the Civil War, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl quickly became an important text for the abolitionist cause. White women readers, especially in the North, found themselves confronted with experiences they had never imagined. Harriet forced them to see that the ideals of motherhood, chastity, and dignity they held dear were systematically denied to Black women under slavery. Her book was not just testimony, it was an indictment. It accused a nation that called itself free while keeping millions in chains. And it asked readers, especially women, to join the fight against this hypocrisy. Harriet Jacobs did not fade into anonymity after publishing her book. Instead, she embraced her role as both witness and activist, using her freedom and her voice to fight for others. During the Civil War, she worked tirelessly to aid formerly enslaved refugees who fled to Union lines. She traveled to camps, distributed supplies, and organized schools, believing that education was one of the most powerful tools for rebuilding lives shattered by bondage. In this new role, Harriet transformed personal suffering into public service. She had once hidden in silence, watching her children through cracks in the wood. Now, she stood openly in the world, advocating for thousands whose voices were rarely heard. She raised funds, partnered with abolitionists, and worked alongside reformers to ensure that freedom was not just a word, but a lived reality for those emerging from slavery's grip. Her activism reflected a lifelong belief that mothers, children, and families deserved protection, dignity, and opportunity. She saw in the freed people the same yearning for safety and hope that had driven her into hiding years before. Every act of compassion she offered was rooted in the conviction that no one should endure what she had endured. Over time, Harriet's story risked being forgotten. Unlike Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman, her name did not remain widely celebrated in the decades following the war. Incidents in the life of a slave girl fell out of print, and for much of the 20th century, many even doubted whether she had truly written it. But in the 1980s, scholars rediscovered her voice, proving its authenticity and restoring her place in history. Today, Harriet Jacobs is recognized not only as a survivor, but as a pioneer. She was among the first women to write openly about the intersection of slavery, motherhood, and sexual abuse, topics that polite society had long silenced. Her courage in revealing her truth challenged readers in her time, and it continues to challenge us now. Her attic years remain a haunting image. 7 years of darkness, of cramped suffering, of listening to her children from a distance. Yet they also symbolize extraordinary resilience. She transformed that darkness into testimony, and that testimony into action. Her life reminds us that freedom is never simply granted. It is fought for, endured, and carried forward by those brave enough to speak. In the end, Harriet Jacobs gave the world more than a memoir. She gave us a mirror, reflecting both the cruelty of slavery and the unbreakable strength of a mother's love. Her voice, once nearly lost to history, now stands as a testament to endurance, justice, and the enduring fight for human dignity. Harriet Jacobs's life began in chains, was shaped by hiding, and ended in freedom. But her story was never only about herself. It was about the countless women who suffered silently in slavery, enduring abuses that society refused to acknowledge. It was about mothers torn from children, children torn from hope, and families broken apart for profit. By daring to speak, Harriet gave them all a voice. Her 7 years in the attic remain one of the most haunting images in the history of slavery. A woman reduced to living like a shadow, crouched in darkness, straining to hear the laughter of her children through wooden planks. Yet from that cramped silence emerged a roar that couldn't be ignored. When she finally told her story in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she shattered the polite lies of her age and forced the world to confront truths it wished to bury. Her courage shows us that resistance does not always take the form of open rebellion. Sometimes it is the quiet endurance of a mother refusing to yield. Sometimes it is the decision to hide, to wait, to outlast oppression. And sometimes It is the act of writing, of refusing to let history erase the scars of the enslaved. More than 150 years later, Harriet's words still echo. They remind us that freedom is fragile, that justice must be defended, and that even in the deepest darkness, the human spirit can carve a path toward light. Harriet Jacobs was not simply a survivor. She was a fighter, a witness, and a mother whose love defied the weight of an entire system. Her story is a reminder to remember, to honor, and to continue the struggle for dignity and humanity that she carried through 7 years of darkness.